In the last class, we talked about liberalism, and I read a few things from a book on liberalism. Liberalism was in basically the second half of the 19th century and was utterly demolished by Pope Pius IX insofar as exposing it, pointing out its errors. Liberalism primarily promoted indifferentism. One religion is as good as another. Religious liberty, you can choose whatever religion you want to have and so forth. And then we also mentioned briefly Americanism, which was also late 19th century, a heresy of action, basically that everything that really matters is activity and putting contemplation, prayer, the interior life in the back seat. So that was called Americanism. But then we come to the 20th century and we have modernism. So modernism sprang from liberalism and all of the various false philosophies of the 18th and 19th centuries. And modernism was defined by Pope Saint Pius X as the synthesis of all heresies, like everything came together. When you read church heresies, there usually was one particular dogma that a heretic denied or undermined or attacked. Whereas with modernism, it was a host of errors. Modernism was a sort of glorification of science. And of course, that continues today. So putting science on a pedestal and saying, well, if religion can't explain this, then science is more important than religion. So there was this fascination with science and scientific research and so forth. There also, with modernism, another area of error was in biblical research and understanding and interpretation. So the modernists would say things like, well, it couldn't have possibly happened that there were these 10 plagues in Egypt. Reading in the book of Exodus about the plagues, that sounds like a fantastic story. And maybe it was just a story made to show that God was displeased with the Egyptians or whatever. So they would undermine and misinterpret Scripture to suit their purposes. So those were a couple of areas. There also is the area of Ecumenism, and this is a movement that began late 1800s, early 1900s to try and get everybody together. So that was another aspect of modernism. But I want to give you the explanation of modernism from the encyclical of Pope Pius X, Pascendi Dominici Gregis. So we mentioned last time that in 1907, there were two condemnations of modernism. One was in July and was a decree called the Lamentabili, which was more a listing of their errors, similar to the syllabus of errors issued by Pope Pius IX against liberalism. That was in July of 1907. And then 2 months later, the Pope came out with his encyclical against modernism. And then, because the modernists continued to spread their errors and remained in the church and didn't leave the church, he came out with the oath against modernism 3 years later. So in 1910 was the oath. And then encyclical Pascendi in 1907. Now, in this encyclical, the Pope teaches that modernism has a basic idea called vital immanence. And immanence. So I-M-N-A-N-E-N-C-E, immanence. And I hope you can see with these markers. They'll probably stick with the other one. So vital immanence is this idea that God created every man, woman, every human being with a religious sense in our consciousness. And this religious sense that's immanent, that's within, manifests itself in different practices, liturgies, we might say, ceremonies, in different ways, depending on your culture, the way you've been brought up, things that you experience, etc. And that this religious sentiment came from God, and that's within you, but it manifests itself in different ways. And so this idea of vital immanence leads the modernist to approve of Hinduism, Buddhism, Protestantism, every form of pagan practice, etc. How could John Paul II have had these interreligious services to pray for peace at Assisi, in which there were even witch doctors and American Indians and practitioners of voodoo and you name it, and Muslims, etc., all gathered together to pray for peace? Because he believed, he was a total modernist, John Paul II, as are his successors, and he believed in this idea of vital immanence, that we all have this religious sentiment and it expresses itself in different ways. So Hindus, because they live in India and they have their own customs, etc., their religious sentiment expresses itself in their Hindu practices, and so on and so forth. So the point is that a modernist would condone every religion. To a modernist, every religion is good. So that is one of the two main things that I want to point out here about modernism. I'm rewriting it because that green marker, and I'm sorry we don't have, the blue seems to be the better color, or black or brown, but we don't have those right now. So vital immanence, another aspect of modernism is relativism. And relativism is this idea that something that was considered immoral, that was considered wrong 100 years ago, can be perfectly fine today because of the times. We have to keep up with the times. The times have changed, and we live in a different era, and so forth. So they don't have this idea that faith, doctrine, and morality, Catholic living, Christian living, are permanent, that the rules, you might say, the commandments and the doctrines are unchangeable. They have this idea that everything is relative, everything is able to change. I wanted to find this quote, and I'm sorry I didn't get it, but Benedict XVI, whose name was Joseph Ratzinger, and of course he was elected Pope, supposed Pope, after the death of John Paul II in, I think, 2005. And he was there for, 8 or 9 years before he resigned, maybe 2013, so I guess 8 years. He made a comment because people were thinking, how can you call Pope Pius IX blessed? And he condemned religious liberty, and now Vatican II teaches religious liberty. How can that be? And he said something, and I wish I had the quote. He said something, well, what he did was right back then, because that was back then. But now the times are different. So basically he's saying it all depends on the time. What was okay or what was right back then would be wrong today. Now, modernism led to Vatican II, of course. Vatican II was the flowering of modernism, was modernism taking control. And I want to spend a little bit of time on Vatican II right now, because that is where you see modernism in practice. You see the teachings of modernism. We had a few classes ago, we covered Jansenism. And one of the big problems with Jansenism was that the Jansenists didn't leave the church. They stayed within the structure. So there were bishops even and priests and religious that were infected with Jansenistic ideas, but they would always say, oh, we don't believe in anything heretical. They had, you might say, modified Jansenist ideas. They would even say, well, I agree with the Pope's condemnation, but then they were Jansenist in their thinking. And they stayed within the structure of the church, and caused real problems. Well, the modernists did the same thing. They didn't, when they were condemned, and some of the leaders excommunicated, but there were others who were modernist in their thinking, but they remained within the church structure, in the seminaries, in the institutes of higher learning and so forth, promoting their ideas. So that's why Pope Pius X had to come out with the oath against modernism. But despite that oath, they continued to be individuals with modernist ideas within the structure of the church. And after Pope Pius XII died in October of 1958, all of a sudden the modernists started coming out. He was like a dike. He was like a dike that held back the flood of modernism at that time. Bishop Robert McKenna told me a story once. He was ordained in June of 1958. So that's just a few months before Pope Pius XII died. And he said, as soon as Pope Pius XII died, there were professors within the Dominican order, individuals who started coming out with these really modernist ideas. And yet they didn't do that before. But after Pius XII was gone, they felt free to come out with their modernist thinking. So modernism, again, percolated under the surface. Interestingly, Roncalli, who, of course, when he was elected, took the name of John the 23rd. So Roncalli, Angelo Roncalli, the Holy Office had a file on him, and it had in the file, suspected of modernism. He was friends with some modernist teachers. Well, so as we said, when Pope Pius XII died in October 1958, the conclave that met to elect his successor, there was some fishy things that went on with the conclave, because at one point, white smoke came out of the chimney, and it came out for, an extended period, like 30 seconds or something like that, for a while. It just wasn't just real temporary. And then all of a sudden it changed and became black. So there was this thinking that maybe they had elected someone, and then things were changed in the conclave. Nobody knows. We'll only find out in eternity what really happened. But the one who came out of that conclave at end of October, early November, was Angelo Roncalli, who took the name of John the 23rd. And he had been, previous to that election, he had been the papal nuncio to Paris, to France. And later on, it was found out that he was regularly attending the meetings of Freemasons in Paris. There are a lot of things about him that we could talk about, but he was definitely of a modernist thinking. Now, when Pope Pius XII died, there were a number of people that were clamoring for the election of Giovanni Battista Montini, because he was their darling. They wanted him, those who were modernist in their thinking, wanted him. But the problem with Montini, there are a couple problems. He had been working in the Vatican under Pius XII, and Pius XII found out some things about him and was shocked and basically exiled him from the Vatican. But in order to save face for the church, Pope Pius XII made him the Bishop of Milan in northern Italy. And that was in maybe 54, 55. And then there were individuals that were pressing for the Pope make him a cardinal, people that thought that Montini was so great. He refused to do so. But interestingly, when John the 23rd was elected, Roncalli, he made Montini a cardinal almost immediately. He came out with a new list of bishops that are going to be cardinals, and at the top of the list was Montini. And that was like within a month or so of his election. So again, modernists, they wanted Montini to be the successor of Pope Pius XII, but he wasn't even a cardinal. So Roncalli, who was elderly, was looked upon as a sort of transitional figure. More conservative persons could tolerate that election. The liberals liked it. They thought, he'll make Montini a cardinal and this will pave the way for Montini, which is exactly what happened. Now, what's interesting thing about John the 23rd, like I said, he was elected, I don't remember the date, the end of October or for early November, 1958. In January, so this is only a few months later, he had a meeting with some cardinals and he came out with a statement, I'm going to call a general council. And they were flabbergasted because, he had just been elected recently. There didn't seem to be a need for a general council. And so the question is, well, what is it for? Now, the last general council, before he called this council, was called the Vatican Council. And typically a council is called by the name of the city where it is held. But if it's held in Rome, it's usually the basilica where it's held. So there were the Lateran councils, the Lateran Basilica, and then the council in 1870 was the Vatican Council because it was held at St. Peter's, the Vatican Basilica. And so John the 23rd called for a council, and it became known as Vatican II because it was held in the Vatican. Now, there had only been 20 general councils in the history of the church, from the Council of Nicaea in 325 up till Vatican I, 1870, 20 general councils. So it wasn't a very frequent thing, the average of one a century on average. But so this was kind of a shocking thing that he would call a council, and that he did it without consulting any of his advisors, the cardinals. He just came out with this. And someone asked him, what's going to be the purpose of this council? And he walked over to a window and opened the window and said, we're going to let some fresh air into the church. As though, the church is this musty and old and stale, and we have to kind of brighten things up. Now, the very opening of the council, which was on October 11th, I believe, 1962. October 11th is a feast of the Divine Maternity. So the council opened on October 11th, and then it would conclude each year in early December, like December 8th or by December 8th. So you had 4 sessions. So this was 1962, 1963, 1964, and then the final session, it ended on December 8th of 1965. Now, interestingly, there are several interesting things. I mean, many books have been written about kind of the goings-on at the council. But one very interesting fact is that John the 23rd appointed a commission to prepare for the council. And what the members of this commission did is that they wrote letters to every bishop in the world, every Catholic bishop, at least every ordinary, meaning a bishop of a diocese, and they asked, what do you want to see discussed at the upcoming council? And the bishop sent in the answers, they put them all together, and they came up with preparatory documents or outlines of what the bishops wanted. Overwhelmingly, many of them wanted a formal condemnation of communism. John the 23rd made a secret agreement with Khrushchev that he would not allow communism to be brought up at Vatican II. And when Vatican II started, the official commission had their preparation, their documents that they wrote to the bishops, what do you want, and had this all there. That was nowhere to be found. That had been completely disregarded, and a whole new set of preliminary documents was brought forth by individuals nobody knew who did this, who was the commission. They weren't the official commission. The official commission got the input from the bishops, and they had these preliminary schema, as they were called. Those were just completely disregarded, and they had a whole new set put together by modernists behind the scenes. Nobody knows exactly who, worked on them. So that's an interesting thing. At the opening session, which had been October 11th, 1962, the opening session of Vatican II, John the 23rd gave a speech. And in that speech, he said, this council is not going to condemn anything. What we're going to do is hold out the beauty, the goodness of the Catholic religion as a way to draw people in. Well, of course, the opposite is what happened. It was a disaster. But not condemn anything. That's almost a denial of original sin, because you look at the Ten Commandments, look at how negative they are. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. We only have the ones that only framed positively would be, remember thou keep holy the Lord's day and honor thy father and thy mother. But everything else is, you may not do this, you shall not do this. So man needs clear guidelines. But if you look at the wording of previous councils, like the Council of Trent, there will be a teaching, say, on the Holy Eucharist at the Council of Trent. And then there will be what they call canons. If anyone shall dare to say that Jesus Christ is not present, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist, let him be anathema. If someone teaches this, let him be anathema. Let him be anathema. All of the councils of the church, that's the way they taught. Very clearly defined doctrine. John the 23rd says, we're not going to condemn anything. It's just going to be positive. And the terminology was used that it's a pastoral council. Now, what's this, 2012. I made copies of this for you so you can have it after the meeting. I'm going to go through this article. This is some copies of an article I wrote for the Reign of Mary, for the autumn issue in 2012. So it was 50 years since Vatican II began in 1962. And so this was 2012 in like October, November, when they were commemorating 50 years since the inauguration of the council. So we had an article in the Reign of Mary, and the article isn't long, it's just 4 pages, but I tried to indicate what are the main errors of Vatican II, because people will ask this question, what are the main errors of Vatican II? So I put together, without doing a tremendous amount of research, what I consider to be the main errors of Vatican II, seven different errors, which I want to give you right now. And also I want to say for anyone watching on the live stream, if you want to get a copy of this, just send me an email and I will send you this article. But it was published in issue number 148 of the Reign of Mary in the fall, in autumn of 2012. So what are the specific errors of Vatican II? Oh, and by the way, there was the 4 sessions, October, November, early December of these 4 years. John the 23rd died in the summer, I think it was June of 1963. And so he was only there for the first session. And so Paul VI, his successor, Giovanni Battista Montini, who took the name of Paul VI, is the one who brought the council to conclusion and promulgated all of the documents. All right, so what is in the documents that we would point out as erroneous? And I'm not saying that these are the only problems with Vatican II. What I find is the main issues. And I also want to mention before we do this, that one of the things about modernists, they're like politicians. You know how politicians can say something and you don't know, well, is he for this or is he against it? Politicians try and please everybody. And they speak in a sort of a double speak sometimes, trying to pacify or please everybody to get elected. Well, modernists will say something and you can't pin them down on exactly what they're saying. And in a modernist writing, there will be an appearance, at least, of favoring one thing or favoring its opposite. And Vatican II did that, what I would call doublespeak, where Vatican II would say things like, well, the Latin in the Mass is to be retained. But then in the next sentence, it'll say something like, but where there's a good reason for putting liturgical ceremonies or prayers in the language of the faithful, that may be done. So wait a minute, what are you saying? You're saying Latin is to be retained, but then you're also saying you can use the Vulgate, the language of the people. And that's very typical of Vatican II. And then a conservative can look at it and say to the modernist, you're misinterpreting. This is what it says right here. But the modernist will say, no, you're misinterpreting. This is what it says over here. So Vatican II gave a green light to the modernists and the reformers, those that wanted to change the liturgy and so forth, whereas conservatives will constantly cry out, you're not following Vatican II. All right, so what are the errors? First of all, a false notion of the church. And these aren't necessarily in any order of chronology in the documents or of importance, but just as I was thinking of them, the errors of Vatican II. Vatican II taught that the church that Christ founded subsists in the Catholic Church, subsists in. So it uses this term, whereas the Catholic Church has always taught that the church Christ founded and the Catholic Church are synonymous. You can put an equal sign. The Catholic Church is the church founded by Christ, and the church founded by Christ is the Catholic Church. But Vatican II, with this new terminology, is implying that the church founded by Christ is bigger than the Catholic religion. So the Catholic religion is part of it, but then also maybe the Anglicans are part of it, and the Greek Orthodox are part of it, and so forth. So they came up with this notion of, the Church of Christ is bigger than the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is just a part of it. And we maybe have more truth than others, but we're not the only church founded by Christ. So a false notion of the church. Another error, Vatican II says that the church needs continual reformation. Now, it sounds like Martin Luther, Reformation. Now, there have always been issues with the members of the church, with individuals who go off into maybe an immoral lifestyle. And the bishops and the Pope need to come out and, correct evil, denounce error, and so forth. Because the church is made up of human members. So we've always had, down through the history of the church, unworthy members, individuals, even bishops or popes or priests that would maybe not give a good example. So individuals need reform. But the church herself needs continual reform. So that makes it sound like the church has been wrong in different things. And I don't know if you remember, during the time of John Paul II, who was the supposed pope for like 32 years or so, that during that time, there was all these apologies. We have to apologize to this group and apologize to that group for things that the church did years ago, which very often were not properly understood by people of our day and so forth. But that's this idea. The church needs continual reform. Another error is that false religions, non-Catholic religions, other religions, are or can be means of salvation. Now, to my thinking, this is one of the main errors of Vatican II, that if you say that a religion that was founded by a man, it's not the divinely founded religion founded by Jesus Christ, the Catholic religion, but a religion founded by a man can lead its members to salvation. That's a blasphemous thought. to think that someone can just spurn the church founded by Christ, found their own religion, and God will use that religion as a means of salvation. Now, someone who is in a false religion, by cooperating with actual grace, can come to a knowledge of the truth, but it's not the religion that's the means of salvation. It's the grace of God that that person cooperates with. So that's another error. And I think in this article, I give some quotes from Vatican II to show, or which decree that can be found in. Okay, the fourth error that I find is a new concept of the hierarchy. Now, we have to understand that our Lord founded his church. He founded it to be a hierarchical structure. So what do we mean by hierarchy? Is we have the Pope, and under him you have the bishops, and under them you have the priests, and then you have the faithful. And of course, in between there are others, like there's cardinals and there's abbots and so forth. But the Pope is the supreme authority on earth, the vicar of Christ on earth. The bishops have their authority from him. They are a supreme authority in their dioceses, subject to the Pope, and the priest is a pastor that's appointed a pastor of a parish. The church is not horizontal, it's vertical. But Vatican II came out now with a new term here, and this new term is collegiality. And collegiality, we could say it's like making the Pope the chairman of the board. He's just kind of like the president of the board. And that's why they have all these synods that you hear of every couple of years or every few years, a new synod. So it's the idea of giving the bishops more authority and reducing the authority of the Pope or the supposed Pope. So this collegiality idea is an attack on the papal supremacy, the papal authority, the primacy of St. Peter and his successors. All right, the next area is a destruction of the liturgy. And of course, we're primarily referring to liturgy. Can't write very well this evening. Destruction of the liturgy. Primarily, we're talking about the changes in the Mass that culminated in the Novus Ordo Missae. Vatican II ended in 1965. The Novus Ordo came out in 1967. It was promulgated, became official in 1969, and became mandatory to the exclusion of the Tridentan Latin Mass in 1970. I think Palm Sunday of 1970. Novus Ordo became mandatory. But Vatican II, you read the document on the liturgy and you find these modernist ideas in there that resulted in the Novus Ordo Missae. And one of the things, we could have a separate class on the Mass, the change of the Mass, the destruction of the Mass. A lot of times we'll just talk about the words, the change of the words of consecration. But one of the primary things you see in the new Mass is that it is anthropocentric, man-centered, whereas Catholic liturgy is God-centered. The priest has his back towards the people because he's offering the sacrifice to God, whereas in the Novus Ordo, they get rid of the altar and bring in a table. Now it's called a meal, no longer a sacrifice, and the priest is facing the people, and he's more like a presider, the president. And there's all these lay people that get up to do readings and so forth. And, they have the presentation of the gifts. They have the handshake, the so-called kiss of peace. And they have the people taking communion in the hands and lay people giving out communion and so forth. But it's centered on the people, on the community, instead of a divinely centered worship for the worship of Almighty God. So the destruction of the liturgy, and I don't know if you can see if I go any lower than that, so come back up here with number 6. Like I say, I find 6 main errors in Vatican II. Okay, so after the liturgy, the next one is a false idea of religious liberty. Now, we talked a little bit about this in our last class about the fact that Pope Leo XIII wrote an encyclical on liberty, and he said liberty is something that ennobles a man. It's using the gift of free will that God gave us to choose something that is good. But as opposed to liberty is license. License would be abusing one's free will, using one's free will to choose sin. That's not liberty, that's license. That's a misuse of free will. So, what's a true idea of religious liberty? Well, the proper concept would be that states, governments are forbidden to suppress in their countries because it is from God. And man has a free will, and so man ought to choose, that's liberty, choose to worship God the way he wants to be worshiped. So that's true religious liberty, where we have the freedom in our country to practice our faith, and the government may not take that away from us. That's the proper concept of religious liberty. But Vatican II came up with this idea, well, it didn't come up with it, but it promoted it, this idea that every man is free to choose to worship God the way he wishes. And as a result of that false teaching, which, by the way, Pope Pius IX, in an encyclical called Quanta Cura, condemned this idea of religious liberty. He said that he condemned that erroneous opinion, especially fatal to the Catholic Church and to the salvation of souls, called by our predecessor, Pope Gregory XVI, insanity. In other words, Pope Gregory XVI, who preceded Pius IX in the mid-1800s, called the idea of religious liberty insanity. It is insanity to think that Christ would come down into this world, God the Son, establish a church, but that God is fine with any man coming along and saying, oh, I know Christ established a Catholic Church, but no thanks. I choose to do this. I choose to found my own religion or to join a man-made religion. To think that God would sanction that is insanity. So that understanding of religious liberty is entirely contrary really to logic, but also to everything the church has ever taught. So in the documents of Vatican II, translated into English, which I have a copy, there's a footnote there by the priest who translated it, and he said, how can you reconcile this with what the church has taught in the past? What Vatican II is teaching, how can you reconcile it? And he says, I don't know, but I'm sure theologians in the future are going to figure that out, how it can be reconciled. Because they know it's new, it's different, it's contrary to what was taught before. And this is where Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, used to come out with his terminology, because he was a brilliant man, he was a professor of theology, and he called it an hermeneutic of continuity, which is another way of saying that, well, Vatican II is just continuing what the Catholic Church has done down through the ages. There's a continuity. There's not a rupture. There's not a break. There's a continuity. Well, that's wishful thinking, because it very clearly is a rupture, a new teaching contrary to what the church taught before. So that is, an idea that liberalism taught and the Modernists took up, and at Vatican II was made basically an official teaching of the church, of the modern church. Now, here's an interesting fact about Vatican II. The results of Vatican II. We're not used to this because we've been raised in a country that is secular, and its constitution is not based upon Catholic teaching, obviously. But there are, or have been, I should say, Catholic countries in Europe. And one of the great Catholic countries in Europe was Spain. Now, Spain, after the communist civil war in Spain, which was from 1936 to 1939. And the communists were defeated by Francisco Franco and the Catholics, etc. And they, eliminated this threat to Spain. They came up with a constitution, and in the Spanish constitution it says that the country of Spain respects the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, that the Roman Catholic religion is the only religion recognized in Spain, and that if there are other religions people believe in or practice, they may not proselytize. So Jehovah's Witnesses couldn't go from door to door in Spain under Franco or before Vatican II and try and promote their religion. If they believed it and they practiced it privately, that was tolerated. But the only religion that was recognized by the state as a true religion was the Roman Catholic religion. So consequently, the laws of Spain in that constitution from Franco were reflected the teachings of the Catholic Church. Abortion was outlawed, homosexuality, divorce, pornography. All of these things were not just against morality and against the teachings of the church. They were against the civil law, because the civil law reflected the Ten Commandments. When Vatican II came, Spain changed its constitution, and it said right in the new constitution that they're doing this to follow the teachings of Vatican II. And what happened? Abortion, divorce, pornography, homosexuality, all of that came into Spain after Vatican II because it changed its constitution and accepted the teachings of Vatican II on this liberty, which really is, like we said, license, not liberty. So the damage, the harm to souls and society caused by Vatican II is incalculable. In this country alone, there were just hundreds, thousands of nuns and priests that left the religious life, went off and got married and just abandoned their faith and so forth. An absolute scandal. But it was like an exodus after Vatican II in the late 60s and early 70s of priests and religious, etc., because of the destructive teachings of Vatican II. Well, one more error that I want to point out, and that was a very significant one, was an idea of false ecumenism. Now, to have an idea of true religious unity, all we need to do is read the encyclical of Pope Pius XI called Mortalia Monimos. I think it was 1929 that he wrote that encyclical, but it's a small encyclical, not real long, easy to read, but outstanding. But he's very clear and to the point. And what he says is the only way to have true religious unity is if those who are in error renounce their error and embrace the truth. Then we have true unity. But what happened with Vatican II? They began to promote this ecumenism, and then this in turn led to what they call interfaith services. So you'll get a Catholic priest, and you get a Jewish rabbi, and you get a Muslim imam, and you'll get an Anglican clergyman, and maybe another Protestant, whatever, and they'll get together and they'll each say a prayer, and they'll get together and have an interfaith ceremony. And also, as a result of this ecumenism, they'll have, like in the Vatican II Church, they'll have a wedding. Let's say it's a mixed marriage where there's a Catholic marries a non-Catholic. They'll have the pastor of the non-Catholic and the pastor of the Catholic, the priest, both do the wedding jointly. And then if there's a mass, they'll give communion to the non-Catholic as well as the Catholic. All of these kind of things resulting from ecumenism. But it's this idea that unity at any cost. And it's almost laughable that in the Vatican, they have these different committees or groups headed by a cardinal or bishop that's in charge of unity with the Lutherans and unity with the Muslims and unity with the Jews, etc. And they'll come out with joint statements, and it's always egg on the face for the Catholic religion. It's always the Catholic religion. It's like, we believe this, we believe devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, but we won't talk about it because these Protestants might be offended. So we won't talk about hell. We won't talk about the papacy. We won't talk about, honoring the saints or relics, images, anything that they're offended by. We just won't talk about that. What do we both believe? So it's just a false idea of unity. And of course, eventually it leads to Catholics undermining or denying or losing their faith. So those are 7 errors that I find in Vatican II. But again, you look at the results of Vatican II, and that's where you see the absolute disaster that Vatican II was. But Vatican II, again, was the flowering of modernism. Modernism finally coming out into the open and promoting its ideas of vital immanence and relativism and just the various other errors, false religious liberty, etc., that the liberals, late 19th century, and then the modernists believed in, and they continue to promote that. I would say a couple of the areas going back, in my life to my younger days, where you would see modernism was in scriptural understanding or interpretation of scriptures. Modernists were very big in that area. And also, like I said, the liturgy, changing the liturgy, adapting the liturgy. They would have these. I was once traveling, and I went to the seminary that I had once attended. And there was still in operation at that time. This would have been, I think, early 80s. And I was trying to get some libers because they had in the music room, they had the liber usualis, and those are hard to come by and they're expensive. And they gave me some books, but the music director said, well, I want to hold on to these for now because every now and then we'll sing something from them. And then he said, I'm sorry, I need to go because I need to write the liturgy for tomorrow. Now, this was on Saturday afternoon. I need to write the liturgy for tomorrow. He was the music teacher there at the seminary. I mean, it's just, crazy. This takeover by these different experts, who studied liturgy, went to a liberal, so-called Catholic university, studied liturgy, and now they're writing the liturgy and composing things, etc. So Vatican II, an absolute disaster and a result of modernist teaching. Now, we have finished the heresies basically up to pretty much our own times, but there are 2 errors left that I want to talk about that are important for us today, because they're still an issue even among the traditional movement. 2 in particular, I might come up with 1 or 2 others, but 2 in particular. So that'll be our next and final class